What if the story of humanity didn't begin in Eden, but in rebellion long before the first breath of Adam, long before fig leaves and forbidden fruit, before dust became flesh? Scripture whispers the name of a man who never died, a man who walked so closely with God that he was taken. His name was Enoch, and though the Bible mentions him only briefly, there exists a much older, much deeper account of what he saw. A book once read by ancient prophets and early Christians. A book now banned, buried, and nearly forgotten. The Book of Enoch. This isn't legend. This isn't myth. The Book of Enoch is real. It was discovered in ancient scrolls near Qumran and preserved for centuries by Ethiopian believers. It was quoted by Jude in the New Testament, and its pages reveal a truth so vast, so unsettling, that it was erased from history. It speaks of angels who were sent to watch, but chose instead to descend, of a secret covenant forged atop Mount Hermon, of giants born from heaven and earth, of a corruption so deep it changed the bloodline of humanity, and of a flood not just to judge sin, but to cleanse creation itself. If you've ever wondered why the world feels broken in ways no doctrine can explain, if you've sensed that something ancient still echoes in our bones, then stay with me, because what Enoch saw was never meant to be forgotten. And now that it has resurfaced, the veil is beginning to tear. In this video, we'll step into the lost testimony of the man who vanished, the witness to heaven's rebellion, the one who saw what comes next. And it all begins with a question. Who was Enoch, the man who walked with God and disappeared, the man who vanished? Who was Enoch? He appears only briefly in Genesis. A single sentence tucked quietly among the genealogies. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. No fanfare, no explanation, just a name and a vanishing. But within that sentence lies a mystery that has haunted the faithful for generations. What does it mean to walk so closely with the Creator that death is no longer required? What did Enoch see that the world was not yet ready to bear? Enoch was the seventh from Adam, the great-grandfather of Noah, a bridge between the early days of Eden and the judgment of the flood. While others lived and died, Enoch was taken, translated, as some say, into another realm. Hebrews 11:5 affirms this wonder. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. The scriptures do not call it a myth. They do not call it metaphor. They call it faith. But outside the canon, the fragments of Enoch's journey remain. In the scrolls buried at Qumran, in the sacred traditions of Ethiopia, in the faint echoes preserved by early Christian writers. And these fragments speak not of legend, but of witness of a man who saw with unveiled eyes what lies beyond the veil. According to the Book of Enoch, his walk with God was not just spiritual devotion, it was a literal ascent. Carried by angels, Enoch journeyed through realms of light and judgment, past the firmament into the dwelling places of heaven. He beheld the thrones, the watchers, the halls where stars are named and courses fixed. He was no longer just a man, he was a recorder of eternity, a scribe of divine memory. Why would God choose him? The book does not give a full answer, but it suggests one. Enoch was pure, not merely righteous in action, but uncorrupted in spirit and lineage. In a world already unraveling, already shadowed by the fall of unseen beings, Enoch remained untainted. He listened, he obeyed. And because of that obedience, he was entrusted with things most would not survive to speak of. But if Enoch saw heaven, it was only after he first saw what had gone wrong on earth. For before he rose, he witnessed the beginning of a descent, one not of man, but of angels. And their names were the Watchers. The Watchers, angels who crossed a line. They were not cast down in rage like Lucifer. They did not war in heaven or rebel with swords. No, their fall was quieter, more seductive. The Watchers were angels assigned by God to observe the affairs of humanity, to watch and not interfere. But on the slopes of Mount Hermon, they made a pact, not with God, not with man, but with each other. 200 of them descended their leader, named Semjaza. And together they looked upon the daughters of men, not with compassion, not with stewardship, but with desire. What began as observation twisted into obsession. What was meant to remain above breached the boundaries below. According to the Book of Enoch, this covenant was not just a defiance of duty, it was the opening of a gate through which not only celestial beings entered the human realm, but forbidden knowledge as well. These Watchers, once bound by heaven's law, began to teach humanity what had been sealed away: metallurgy, weaponry, sorcery, astrology, beautification. The knowledge they offered was dazzling, powerful, and deadly. Azazel, another of the Watchers, is said to have taught men the art of war, the making of swords and armor, and women the seductive use of paints and jewels. The line between wisdom and corruption blurred. What was divine became defiled. And yet this wasn't just a spiritual betrayal, it was physical. These angels took human wives and fathered children with them, beings neither fully human nor fully divine. And in doing so, they didn't just break a command, they altered the fabric of creation itself. This was not rebellion for the sake of power, it was rebellion for the sake of union, of joining what was never meant to mix. And from this unholy union, something monstrous was born. They were called the Nephilim, and they would devour the world. The Nephilim giants, born of heaven and earth. They were not like other men. Towering, ravenous, relentless, born of celestial seed and human womb, the Nephilim walked the earth as abominations. The Book of Enoch describes them as giants who consumed all that humanity could offer: food, livestock, resources, and when that was gone, they turned on men themselves. They were destroyers, not just in stature, but in nature. Genesis 6 briefly names them, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, the mighty men of old men of renown. But the Bible does not explain what they were. It only hints just enough to stir unease. And in Numbers 13, when the Israelite spies report seeing descendants of the Nephilim in Canaan, they describe themselves as grasshoppers in comparison. These were not poetic metaphors. They were records of terror. Enoch fills in the silence. These hybrid offspring were not simply oversized men. They were spiritual violations. Their existence was a defilement of both realms' flesh that should not have existed, and their presence poisoned the earth. But the corruption didn't stop at their bodies. It spread into the soil, into the bloodlines, into the genetic memory of creation itself. The laws of nature began to bend. Animals turned violent. Humanity spiraled into chaos. Blood cried from the ground, and heaven watched as the world staggered under the weight of what had been unleashed. It wasn't just sin, it was a rupture. The image of God once breathed into man was being overwritten by something that had no place in the order of creation. And the stain was deepening, not just in behavior, but in being. If this is true, if the Nephilim were not myth but memory, then the flood was not merely judgment. It was a last resort, a mercy for what could no longer be healed. And that mercy would come in the form of a storm, a flood not born from weather, but from grief. A divine grief that said this world as it is cannot continue. But one man, one family would be chosen to begin again, not because they were perfect, but because they remained uncorrupted, because their blood was still clean, because their lineage had not been touched. That man was Noah, and his survival would mark the end of the Nephilim and the echo of Enoch's warning. The great flood judgment on DNA, not just sin. For generations, the story of the flood has been told as a moral reckoning, a divine response to the wickedness of mankind. And yet, when read through the lens of Enoch, the waters of judgment take on a deeper, more sobering meaning. This was not just a punishment for sin. It was an intervention, a cleansing of a world that had been genetically altered, spiritually desecrated, and biologically infected by something that was never meant to exist. Genesis 6:9 describes Noah as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. But the Hebrew word used tamim also means without blemish, a term often used in reference to the unblemished animals suitable for sacrifice. This description suggests something more than moral purity. It suggests physical integrity, an untainted lineage, a body and blood untouched by the contamination of the Watchers and the Nephilim. The flood then becomes a kind of cosmic reset, not merely a symbolic washing of sin, but an act of divine quarantine. The earth had been overtaken by hybrids, and the very structure of life, its DNA, its spiritual resonance was unraveling. The only remedy was to start again, not to edit or reform, but to erase and recreate. And so the rains came, not as a surprise, but as a judgment long foretold. Enoch had seen it before he vanished. He had warned the Watchers. He had pleaded for mercy on their behalf. But their sentence was sealed. Chained beneath the earth, the Watchers were cast into darkness, and their offspring, the giants, were swept away by the rising waters. But judgment is never the end of the story. In the ark, sealed by God's own hand, floated a remnant, a family that carried within them the last echo of the original design. Through Noah, humanity would begin again. But the memory of what had happened, the breach between heaven and earth, the mingling of spirit and flesh, would never fully vanish. It would resurface in whispers and ruins in the bloodlines of kings and the myths of nations. And yet one figure would not be in the ark. One man had already been taken, not in death but in light. Enoch, the witness, the scribe, the one who walked with God, had already crossed the veil. And what he saw beyond the flood was more than survival. It was revelation, the ascent of Enoch, what he saw beyond the veil. Enoch did not die. He was not buried. He left no bones behind. Genesis tells us he walked with God and was not, for God took him. Hebrews affirms it, he was taken so that he should not see death. But the Book of Enoch reveals where he went and what he saw. He was escorted by angels, not just into heaven, but through realms, layers of creation, unseen by the living. He passed through the gates of stars, through burning mountains, through the prisons of the fallen, through vaults where time itself is measured. In visions that pulse with cosmic terror and holy awe, Enoch beheld the architecture of existence. He saw the Watchers bound in chains, beneath the earth groaning in the darkness, awaiting their final judgment. He saw the throne of the Most High ablaze with glory, surrounded by wheels of fire and rivers of light. He was shown the storehouses of wind and snow, the places where thunder sleeps the gates that open for morning and evening. He saw the tree of life. He saw the book of records. He saw the souls of the righteous waiting for redemption. But perhaps most chilling, most prophetic, were the scrolls he was made to read accounts not only of what had been, but of what would be. Enoch saw a vision of the future. Not a single timeline, but a spiral 7 epochs of human history. In these cycles, kingdoms would rise and fall, the righteous would suffer, the corrupt would rule, and judgment would sweep through the world like fire through dry grass. He saw the coming of a Son of Man prefigured long before Christ was born. He saw thrones prepared for judgment and books opened in the heavens. He saw the day when justice would no longer be delayed. Enoch's ascent was not escape, it was appointment. He was chosen not to avoid death, but to become a witness across time. A messenger whose testimony would pierce through the silence of history. But this sacred testimony was not welcomed. It was hidden, silenced, stripped from the canon, brushed aside as too symbolic, too mysterious, too dangerous. Because what Enoch revealed was not only the past and the present, he spoke of a reckoning still to come. And those who guarded power were not ready for what he saw. So the question lingers, not just what did Enoch see, but why was his voice taken from us? And who in the shadows of history decided the truth was too much to bear, silencing the witness? Why was Enoch removed? It was not the people who rejected Enoch. For centuries, his writings were cherished, read by Jews, before the time of Christ, quoted by early Christian apostles, preserved with reverence by the faithful in distant lands. The Book of Enoch was not heresy. It was scripture to many, until it wasn't. As the early church grew in power, it began to organize, to centralize, to control. The question was no longer just what is true, but what is safe. Councils were convened, doctrines debated, and in the shadow of empire decisions were made not only to protect the faith, but to preserve authority. The Council of Nicaea did not explicitly ban the Book of Enoch, but the process of canonization that unfolded over the following centuries slowly pushed it aside. Why some said it was too mystical, others claimed it lacked clear authorship, but deeper currents suggest another motive. Enoch's writings speak of angelic rebellion, of forbidden knowledge, of celestial secrets corrupted and taught to mankind. It names the spirits behind war and vanity, behind sorcery and bloodshed. It exposes a hidden history, one where the roots of evil stretch not merely through human sin, but through heavenly betrayal. To accept Enoch is to accept that the line between heaven and earth has been crossed before and may still be crossed again. That humanity's greatest struggles are not only internal, but interdimensional. That spiritual warfare is not a metaphor, but a memory. More than this, Enoch speaks of a divine justice not managed by men, not postponed by councils, but written in the stars. He speaks of thrones prepared for judgment, not just for sinners, but for powers, for watchers, for rulers who claim dominion, but serve no light. Perhaps that was the danger. Not that Enoch lied, but that he remembered too much. And the ones who buried his book feared that remembering. Yet even as his writings were removed from the West, they endured in the East. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never abandoned the Book of Enoch. For them, it was never apocrypha. It was always sacred. And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves of Qumran, Enoch returned his words preserved in clay and time, a witness rising again. But his message is not merely ancient, it stretches forward. Because what Enoch saw did not end with a flood or with chains in the abyss. It continues, in cycles, in signs, in us. Echoes of Enoch is the story repeating. Time in the eyes of the ancients was never a straight line. It moved in spirals, returning, echoing, deepening. Enoch saw this. In his visions, history unfolded not as a single path, but as 7 great epochs, each marked by human rebellion, divine intervention, and the slow turning of justice. He saw that what had been would be again, that the sins of the watchers, the rise of false knowledge, the corruption of blood and truth, would not remain buried in the past. And now, standing in our own age, we must ask, are the signs returning? There is a restlessness in the world today, a hunger for hidden knowledge, a fascination with forbidden power. The boundaries between science and spirit blur. We alter DNA. We create life in labs. We peer into the heavens, searching not just for stars, but for messengers. And beneath it all, a quiet murmur rises, a sense that we have seen this before. Could we be living in one of Enoch's final cycles? He spoke of rulers rising with false glory, of a world intoxicated with its own wisdom, of technology untethered from righteousness. He saw the righteous made to suffer the truth, silenced by noise, and a people so numbed by comfort that they forget the storm already forming on the horizon. And yet Enoch also saw hope. He saw thrones of judgment prepared not only for punishment, but for restoration. He saw a great Son of Man, a messianic figure who would arise not only to rule, but to cleanse. One who would strike the corrupt with the breath of his mouth and restore the inheritance of the faithful. This figure bears striking parallels to the Messiah revealed in Revelation. And so we must wonder, did John see the same visions Enoch did? Or were they 2 witnesses separated by time, but joined by a single truth? Their messages do not contradict. They converge. Both speak of a world on the brink. Both point toward a purification that will burn through pretense and pride. Both call us to remember the old paths, to return not only to faith, but to purity, to truth, to awe. And if these ancient cycles are indeed turning once more, then the question is not, when will judgment come? The question is, are we ready to remember what was hidden? Because Enoch's final message is not about angels or giants. It is about awakening, about shaking off the veil of silence, about choosing light when the world returns to shadow. And if you've heard the echo, then maybe you were meant to. The Book of Enoch was never meant to disappear. Like a seed buried in silence, it waited hidden in the shadows of canon, guarded by dust and time until the right generation would remember. And perhaps that generation is us. Enoch's story is not just a window into the past. It is a mirror held up to our present, a reminder that rebellion once began not in human hearts, but in heaven's own ranks. That knowledge can be both a gift and a curse. That there are truths so powerful, they are feared not because they are false, but because they awaken. To walk with God as Enoch did is not to escape the world. It is to carry revelation through it, to see clearly in an age of distortion, to remember what others chose to forget. And maybe that's the invitation left open for us, not just to believe, but to see, to look beyond the official stories and ask with trembling honesty, what has been hidden in plain sight? Scripture is not diminished by mystery. It is deepened by it. And in rediscovering the voices that were once silenced, we don't weaken our faith, we strengthen its foundation. If this journey stirred something in your spirit, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What stood out? What questions remain? And most importantly, what do you believe the story of Enoch reveals about the God who watches judges and still walks with those who are willing? Like, share, and subscribe If you'd like to see more forgotten truths and ancient mysteries explored with reverence and depth, your support helps keep these investigations alive and these voices no longer silent.